Chapter 4. Passepartout visits a temple. The Mongolia was a very fast ship, and it traveled quickly down to Aden. Most of the passengers were army officers and government officials, and life on the ship was very pleasant. There was always lots of food. There was music and even dancing when the sea was calm. But whether the sea was calm or rough, Phileas Fogg remained the same. He did not come up onto the decks and did not take any interest in the sights of the Red Sea. He just ate his 4 meals every day and played whist. He had found some partners, and they played for many hours every day. The day after they left Suez, Passepartout was on deck when he met Mr. Fix. Mr. Fix told him that he worked for the ship's company. He did not want Passepartout to know that he was a police officer who was trying to arrest Phileas Fogg. After this, they often met and talked to each other. The ship passed Mocha on the 13th of October and reached Aden the next day. It was 15 hours ahead of schedule. Here, it took on more fuel, which took 4 hours. Phileas Fogg went ashore and had his passport stamped, and then returned to the ship while Passepartout looked around the town. That evening, the Mongolia left Aden and headed across the Indian Ocean toward Bombay. The sea was calm, and the wind came from the right direction. The ship used its sails as well as its engines to travel quickly to Bombay, where it arrived 2 days early, on the 20th of October. India was a very large country. It had 1,400,000 square miles of land and a population of 180 million. It was part of the British Empire, but some parts of it were still very independent. Until 1857, the famous East India Company was very powerful. It bought most of the land from the Rajas. However, the lands were now controlled by the British government. Every part of India was different, and it was once very difficult to travel from one part of it to another. In 1872, however, there were steamboats going up and down the main rivers, and a railway crossed the entire country from Bombay to Calcutta. The journey could be made in 3 days. If the railway line were a straight line between the two cities, the journey would have taken even less time. But it detoured north to take in Allahabad. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Mr. Fogg and Passepartout disembarked in Bombay. Mr. Fix also disembarked. Passepartout went to the shops to buy some things that his master wanted, while Phileas Fogg walked to the passport office. When his passport was stamped, he walked to the railway station and ordered a meal. Mr. Fix went straight to the police station and asked if the arrest warrant had arrived. It had not. Mr. Fix asked the Bombay police to give him a warrant, but they said that they couldn't because the crime had not been committed in India. Mr. Fix was disappointed, but he thought that Phileas Fogg would stay in Bombay for a while, so he decided to wait. Passepartout bought some shirts and socks. Then he walked around the streets of Bombay, looking at the many different kinds of people that he saw there. He was very interested in everything that he saw. He saw a temple and went in to have a look at it. He did not know that he had to take off his shoes. He was admiring the beautiful ornaments in the temple when somebody knocked him down and 3 priests took off his shoes and socks. They shouted at him and began to hit him. Passepartout got up and knocked 2 of the priests to the floor. Then he ran from the temple as quickly as he could. The train for Calcutta was due to leave at 8 o'clock. Passepartout arrived at the station at 5 minutes to 8. He had lost his hat and the shirts and socks that he had bought and had no shoes. Mr. Fix was at the station and saw him arrive. Passepartout did not see him, but Mr. Fix heard Passepartout tell his master about the attack in the temple. Mr. Fix realized that he could now get a warrant for Passepartout's arrest because he had committed a crime in India. The British government had made laws that punished people who acted against India's religious rules. Mr. Fix went to the police station to try to get a warrant for his arrest, but it took too long, and he did not catch the train. Phileas Fogg and Passepartout shared a passenger car on the train with Sir Francis Cromarty. Phileas Fogg had played whist with him on the Mongolia. Sir Francis knew about Phileas Fogg's plan to travel around the world in 80 days, and wondered whether Phileas Fogg would do anything useful or good in his life. He tried to tell his friend about the country they were passing through, but Mr. Fogg was not interested. "Your servant almost ruined your plan," said Sir Francis. "How?" asked Phileas Fogg. "He could have been arrested for that trouble in the temple," replied Sir Francis. "How would that ruin my plan?" asked Phileas again. He would have been put in jail, and you would have had to wait for him." "Not at all," replied Phileas. "I would have given him some money and gone on without him." The train traveled through the night as the gentleman slept. In the morning, Passepartout looked out of the window to watch the scenery. At first, they were traveling across a plain. Then they traveled through a jungle. He saw a tiger run away from the sound of the train. Later, they traveled through a forest. He saw elephants looking at the train as it sped past. At midday, the train stopped at Burhanpur, and Passepartout bought some slippers. The travelers had lunch, and the train set off again. Chapter 5. The Newspapers Are Wrong. As they sped across India, Passepartout thought about his master. Until then, he had not believed that he intended to travel around the world in 80 days. He did not believe the story of the bet. Now, he had changed his mind. It must be true. He even began to worry that the train was not moving fast enough. He did not want his master to lose the bet. He was very sorry that he had gone into the temple. He had almost ruined his master's plan. He decided to be more helpful. The next day, the 22nd of October, Sir Francis asked Passepartout about the time. Passepartout took out his watch. 3 o'clock in the morning, sir, he replied. Sir Francis explained to him that this could not be correct. It is 3 o'clock in London, but it is 7 o'clock here. You should change the time on your watch by 4 minutes for every degree of longitude that we pass, he said. It was no use. Passepartout would not change the time on his watch. An hour later, the train stopped. They were 15 miles from the station at Rothhall. They had stopped in the middle of a forest, but the conductor went through all the cars telling the passengers to get off. There was no station. Passepartout got off the train and came back very quickly. "Sir, the railway has ended." "What do you mean?" asked Sir Francis Cromarty. "There is no more railway line. The train can go no further." Sir Francis and Phileas Fogg asked the guard where they were. "In a small town called Colby," he replied. "Are we stopping here?" "I think so. The railway line is not finished yet. They are still building it." "The newspapers said the line was finished," said Phileas Fogg. "What can I say? The newspapers are wrong. There are still 50 miles of track to build before we get to Allahabad. The line continues there." Sir Francis was angry. "The ticket says Bombay to Calcutta. Everybody knows that they must find other transport between Colby and Allahabad," replied the guard. Phileas Fogg was not worried. "We will find another way," he said. "It's not a problem. We are 2 days ahead of schedule. I'm sure we will get to Calcutta on time to catch the steamship to Hong Kong." By this time, the other passengers had all found carriages and carts. There were none left for Phileas Fogg, Sir Francis, and Passepartout. "I will walk," said Phileas Fogg. "Sir, I have found some transport," said Passepartout. "What is it?" "An elephant." "Let us go and see it," said Phileas Fogg. 5 minutes later, an Indian man was showing them his elephant. Mr. Fogg tried to hire the elephant and offered £10 per hour. The Indian refused. Mr. Fogg offered £20 and then £40, but the Indian still refused. Phileas Fogg then offered to buy the elephant for £1,000, but still the Indian refused. At last, he agreed to sell it for £2,000. They found a guide who was also an elephant driver. Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty sat in baskets, one on each side of the elephant. The driver sat on the elephant's neck, and Passepartout sat behind him. At 9 o'clock, the elephant walked into the forest with its passengers. The guide told them that they could save 20 miles by taking a shorter route through the forest to Allahabad. After traveling for 2 hours, the driver stopped the elephant for a rest. It ate some branches and bushes and drank some water. The passengers were also happy to have a rest. At midday, they moved on. They traveled into an area of Upper Bundelkhand that was rarely visited. They saw some fierce-looking Indians, and the guide kept the elephant well away from them. Passepartout was thinking about the elephant. What would happen to it when they reached Allahabad? Would his master keep it and take it with him? Would he sell it? Would he set it free? At 8 o'clock that night, they stopped at an old house to sleep. They were halfway to Allahabad. It was a cold night, but the travelers were tired, and they all slept well. They set off again at 6 o'clock in the morning, hoping to reach Allahabad that night. They came down the Vindhyas mountains and went around the town of Kalinjar. They stopped under some trees for lunch. Allahabad was only 12 miles away. At 2 o'clock, they set off through a dense forest. At 4 o'clock, they heard noises ahead of them and hid behind some trees. They watched silently as a group of priests came past, singing, dancing, and making music. A large group of men, women, and children followed the priests, all singing a sad song. Behind them was a cart with large wheels carrying the statue of a red woman with 4 arms and a lot of wild hair. It frightened Passepartout, but he remained quiet. "It's the goddess Kali," whispered Sir Francis. "She is the goddess of love and death." Some very old men were dancing around the statue. As they danced, they cut themselves with knives. Behind the cart was another group of priests. They were dragging a beautiful young woman with them. She was wearing many jewels. Behind her were some guards with swords and guns. They were carrying a bed. The dead body of an old man lay on the bed. He was dressed in very expensive clothes. It was easy to see that he was an important man. Musicians followed the guards at the end of the procession. Sir Francis turned to the others. "It's a suttee," he said. The guide nodded his agreement. "What is a suttee?" asked Phileas Fogg. Sir Francis explained. "The young woman will be burned alive. She is the wife of the Rajah, whose body you saw on the bed. When they burn his body tomorrow morning, they will burn her with it." "That's terrible!" exclaimed Passepartout. "The British have tried to stop suttees, but in some parts of India they still do it," explained the guide. "Sometimes the wives want to be killed, but most often they do not. This woman does not want to die, and they have drugged her to stop her from fighting and trying to escape." The guide led the elephant out of the trees and was ready to go on to Allahabad. Phileas Fogg stopped him. "I want to rescue this woman," he said. Chapter 6. Phileas Fogg meets Mrs. Ouda. Phileas Fogg wanted to rescue the young woman from the suttee. It would be difficult and dangerous to do this. It would also take time. "It will put you behind schedule," Sir Francis pointed out. "I am still 12 hours ahead," replied Phileas Fogg. Sir Francis said that he would help. The driver also said he would help, but told them that if they were caught, they could be tortured and killed. Despite this, they decided to go ahead. The guide told them about the young woman. She was an Indian lady from a wealthy family. She had been educated in England. Her parents had died, and she had to marry the old Rajah from Upper Bundelkhand. He died 3 months later. She tried to run away from the suttee, but they caught her quickly and brought her back. Now they are going to burn the old Rajah's body, and she would be burned alive with him. The 4 men went to the temple of Pillaji, where the suttee would take place. They hid in some bushes about 500 yards from the temple. They could hear the priests and musicians singing and howling. They waited until it began to grow dark, and then went quietly toward the temple. They passed a large pile of wood and saw the Rajah's body, lying on top of it, ready to be burned. They crept through the long grass toward the temple. There were guards near the door, and they waited to see if they might fall asleep. They waited a long time, but the guards did not fall asleep. At midnight, they went around to the back of the temple, where there were no windows or doors. This side of the temple was not guarded, and the 4 men quickly began to make a hole in the wall with their pocket knives. Suddenly, they heard a shout inside the temple, and another outside of it. Had somebody seen them? They moved back into the trees and waited. Some guards came to the back of the temple and stayed there. How could they rescue the young lady now? The guide and Sir Francis said they should leave and go to Allahabad, but Phileas Fogg told them to wait. "There is nothing we can do," they told him. "I don't have to be in Allahabad until midday," replied Phileas Fogg, "so we can wait until morning to see if there is a way to rescue her then." They agreed to wait, although it would be dangerous, and there was little hope of rescuing the lady. As it began to grow light, they saw the priests drag the young woman toward the pile of wood. Phileas Fogg had a knife and was about to rush out and try to save her, but Sir Francis held him back. "They will kill you before you get near her," he said. They put the young woman next to the body of her husband on the wood pile. Then they lit the wood, which quickly began to burn. Suddenly, the priests cried out in fear. What was happening? The dead Raja seemed to stand up, carrying the young woman in his arms. He climbed off the woodpile with her. The priests and guards were terrified and threw themselves to the ground. They did not dare to look at this ghost. The ghost walked toward Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis and said to them, "Let's get out of here." It was Passepartout. He had rescued the young lady and terrified the crowd. The four men disappeared into the forest and were soon speeding away on the elephant, still carrying the young lady. The priests soon realized what had happened and chased them. However, the elephant was too fast, and they escaped. Passepartout was very pleased and proud. Sir Francis shook his hand. Even his master said, "Well done." The young lady had fainted and had not woken up yet. Sir Francis told Phileas Fogg that if she remained in India, she would be caught again and killed. Phileas, however, would not tell him what he planned to do. At Allahabad, Passepartout was sent to buy her some clothes while the gentleman waited for the train at the station. The young lady began to wake up, and they discovered that her name was Mrs. Aouda. Passepartout returned with the clothes as the train was preparing to leave for Benares. Phileas Fogg paid the elephant driver. Then he gave the elephant to the driver, who was delighted with this very valuable reward. Soon they were speeding toward Benares. Mrs. Aouda listened to the story of her rescue and was very thankful. However, it was easy to see that she was still afraid. Phileas Fogg offered to take her with him to Hong Kong. This made her feel a lot safer. "I have a rich relative in Hong Kong," she said. "I'm sure that he will look after me." 2 hours later, they were in Benares on the Ganges River. Here, Sir Francis Cromarty said goodbye to his new friends, and they traveled on without him. The train sped through the Ganges Valley that night and arrived at Calcutta at 7 o'clock in the morning. The steamer for Hong Kong was due to leave at midday. Phileas Fogg was still on schedule. "Mr. Phileas Fogg?" It was a police officer who spoke to the traveler as he left the station. "Yes." "Is this man your servant?" "Yes." "Please, come with me." Phileas, Passepartout, and Mrs. Aouda followed him to the police station. Here they were locked in a room. "You will appear before Judge Obadiah at 8:30, he said. Mrs. Aouda and Passepartout were very worried, but Phileas Fogg was as calm as always. "We will be on the ship before midday," he said. At 8:30, the door opened, and the police officer took them to a courtroom. Passepartout thought that they had been arrested for rescuing Mrs. Aouda, but he was wrong. They had been arrested because Passepartout went into a temple in Bombay while wearing his shoes. 2 priests from the temple were witnesses, and they had Passepartout's shoes for proof. Mr. Fix had caught the next train and passed Phileas Fogg and his companions while they were rescuing Mrs. Aouda. Now he sat in the courtroom, smiling. He still did not have a warrant. However, he was sure that the court would put Passepartout in prison. Phileas Fogg would have to wait for him, and the warrant should arrive before they left Calcutta. The first part of his plan worked. The judge said that Passepartout would have to go to jail for 15 days and fined him £300. Then he said that Phileas Fogg would have to go to jail for 8 days and fined him £150. Mr. Fix was surprised when the next part of his plan did not work. Phileas Fogg told the judge that he would pay a bigger fine so they wouldn't have to go to jail. The judge agreed to £1,000 each. Passepartout took his shoes, and the travelers took a carriage to the ship. Mr. Fix was very disappointed. He followed them, although they did not see him. "I will follow them to Hong Kong and wait for the warrant there," he told himself.